Joined today by my colleague, Senator Collins, to introduce legislation aimed at strengthening the government's hand in stopping Medicare fraud. Senator Collins and I have tried to offer some decent leadership to the Senate Committee on Aging. And in the process, we've heard a lot about Medicare and Medicaid fraud. And I want to thank Senators Carper, Grassley, and Casey for partnering with us in joining to sponsor this legislation that we are filing today. Earlier in the year, Senator Collins and I convened a hearing of the Aging Committee to examine what was government doing to prevent Medicare fraud. And the committee heard from law enforcement who told us that despite the recent increases in prosecutions, that Medicare fraud continues to run rampant. It's especially true in my state of Florida, where South Florida remains, unfortunately, ground zero for Medicare fraud. We also heard from the Medicare organization itself about what the program is doing to try to better detect and prevent the con artists from defrauding the system. And then we heard from victims like Patricia Gresko, a former school teacher from Michigan. She testified this unbelievable scam about how her doctor talked her into spending thousands of dollars for treatments for an illness that she later discovered she didn't have. These treatments then caused her to have chest pains and forced her to endure intravenous infusions that took hours. Her doctor was arrested for bilking $225 million from Medicare, and this is what he did. Falsely telling patients that they had cancer, if you can believe this, that they had cancer so that he could bill for expensive chemotherapy treatments. And Ms. Gresko did not have cancer, and she had to endure all of that. Now, today we're losing about $60 to $90 billion a year in Medicare fraud. Just last week, federal agents arrested 90 people. 50 of them, you guessed it, were in Miami. And it was on charges that they had stolen $260 million from the Medicare program. Fortunately, when we passed the Affordable Care Act, we put in provisions, some I might say at my insistence because of ground zero being in our state, and put into the law such things as background checks, site visits for prospective Medicare providers and suppliers. Another one is stronger criminal and civil penalties, and the authority to withhold payment in law where there is a credible allegation of fraud. Now, that's just a few of the weapons in law as a result of the ACA. But this recent set of arrests of 90 people on charges of Medicare fraud tells us something else. We have to stop playing the game of whack-a-mole with Medicare criminals trying to stamp out the fraud one bad actor at a time. You know what whack-a-mole is? You whack this creature on a table, and once you've whacked it, they pop right back up. So naturally, we talked to Sylvia Burwell, the president's nominee for Secretary of HHS, and we echoed that last week at her confirmation hearing in the Finance Committee. And she stated that we need to move away from the pay and chase model, which is what has happened. You have to chase them down. If you catch them, they pop back up again. And so we need a better strategy. And while we're making the strides by more aggressively pursuing this kind of fraud, obviously more needs to be done. And that's what Senator Collins and I are introducing today. The Stop Scams Act, it will require Medicare to verify that those wishing to bill Medicare have not owned a company that previously defrauded the government. And it's going to also allow private insurers and Medicare to share information about the potential fraudulent operators in the system. And the bill also anticipates problems CMS may face in the future. It doesn't delay the rollout of the 10 new medical codes in any way, or shall I say what they refer to the ICD-10 medical codes. There are a lot more of those medical codes. But it takes some lessons learned from the costly delays that have occurred with these codes and uses them to make the process better for the future. The legislation also requires for the new medical coding systems after the ICD-10 that the agency assess the impact on fraud prevention systems and do appropriate testing. So, Mr. President, to combat this fraud, it's going to be one of the core missions of our Aging Committee. We've taken a look at many types of fraud scams, Jamaican phone scams, identity theft, Social Security fraud, payday lending, and now we're continuing to focus on Medicare fraud, and we'll continue to examine additional issues. Every day, Senator Collins and I hear from seniors about scams, and they let us know on our committee's hotline. And I want to remind everybody out there, this hotline is there for you to report these scams. 1-855-303-9470. And we're going to keep this committee going after these scams. And in the meantime, Senator Collins and I hope that our colleagues will join us in support of this legislation to try to really further clamp down on Medicare fraud. And I'm so happy to have the partner that I have in helping lead the Aging Committee, Senator Collins. I would say in closing that we've really got a broad array of folks that are supporting us on this legislation. The National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association, America's Health Insurance Plans, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, the National Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, and Humana Insurance Company. They're all supporters of this legislation. Mr. President, I actually await the comments of my colleague.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm delighted to join my friend, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Aging, Senator Nelson, in introducing legislation to help combat the fraud in the Medicare program. We are introducing the Stop Schemes and Crimes Against Medicare and Seniors, or the Stop Scams Act. As Senator Nelson has described, at our hearings earlier this year, we heard absolutely appalling testimony from a woman who had had to endure painful 7-hour-long series of infusions for a disease that she did not have, just because her doctor was bilking the Medicare program. Imagine a physician who would do that, who would subject a vulnerable patient to the anxiety of thinking that she had a disease that she did not have, and then treating her for a disease she did not have just to collect Medicare dollars. It really was appalling. Mr. President, for decades, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, has identified Medicare as being at high risk for improper payments, abuse, and fraud. In the year 2012, Medicare reported that it had lost more than $44 billion in improper payments due to waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. And that estimate, Mr. President, may well be too low. $44 billion. Think what we could do with that money to improve the quality of health care, the coverage that we're providing to our seniors, or to reduce our unsustainable national debt. This is simply unacceptable. The loss of these funds not only compromises the financial integrity and increases the cost of the Medicare program, but also undermines our ability to provide needed health care services to the more than 54 million older and disabled Americans who depend on this vital program. Mr. President, back in the late 1990s, when I was chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, we held a series of hearings to examine fraud in the Medicare program. We identified the dangerous trend of an increasing number of completely bogus providers entering the system with the sole and explicit purpose of robbing it. One of our witnesses actually testified that he went into Medicare fraud because it was easier and safer than dealing in drugs. He could make a lot more money at far less risk of being caught. Our hearings led to the adoption of some safeguards and better internal controls. But what our continuing hearings, many years later, that we've held have demonstrated is that unscrupulous individuals are always adopting and seeking out new ways to rip off the system. They seem to be always one step ahead of the authorities. I do want to emphasize an extremely important point, and that is that the vast majority of medical professionals are caring, dedicated healthcare providers whose top priority is the welfare of their patients. When we were investigating Medicare fraud in the late 1990s, what we found were a whole lot of individuals posing as healthcare providers who had no medical training whatsoever. I remember one memorable case where, had there been a site visit, it would have been discovered that this bogus provider had an office in the middle of the runway of the Miami airport. But unfortunately, back then, there were no site visits. Healthcare providers, the true professionals, are the ones who are most appalled by the unscrupulous bandits who take advantage of weaknesses in the Medicare program to bleed billions of dollars from the program. As I indicated, we have made some progress over the years in the battle against Medicare fraud since I chaired those hearings. Unfortunately, however, there's no line item in the budget entitled Waste, Fraud, and Abuse that we can simply strike to eliminate this problem and solve it once and for all. The task of ferreting out wasteful and fraudulent spending is made all the more difficult by the ingenuity of the scam artists who continually adopt new methods of ripping off both the Medicare and the Medicaid program. It is clear, as my distinguished chairman indicated, that we must do more than shift from a pay and chase strategy to combat Medicare fraud to one that prevents the harm from ever occurring in the first place. That is what the bipartisan bill that we're introducing today would do. Among other provisions, our legislation would require Medicare to verify that healthcare provider ownership interests using other databases before new healthcare providers are allowed to enroll in the program. That's an upfront control that we can and should implement. Currently, Medicare relies on self-reported information. As a consequence, providers who previously had an ownership interest in an organization that defrauded Medicare can potentially get back into the program by simply using different names and failing to disclose their interests in a previous organization or practice. Our legislation would also allow private insurers to share information about potentially fraudulent providers with Medicare and with each other to prevent further healthcare fraud. It would also allow the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission to make recommendations to us regarding fraud prevention. And our bill would require the Medicare program to develop a strategy for more accurately and reliably estimating just how many dollars are lost each year to fraud. Mr. President, our legislation, as the chairman indicated, is endorsed by a wide variety of organizations, including the National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association, the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, Humana, the America's Health Insurance Plans, and the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud. I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join us in co-sponsoring this important bill, legislation that I believe really can make a difference. I would hope, Mr. President, that this is a bill that we could move quickly. It's a common sense bill. It will save taxpayer and beneficiaries dollars, and it will help to curb the excessive fraud, the unacceptable fraud that is depleting dollars from a program, the Medicare program, that is already under financial strain. So let's move this bill. Let's send it to the House and on to the President for his signature as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President. And again, I want to commend the Senator from Florida for his leadership. It's been a great pleasure to work with him on this important issue. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.